Hello and welcome to the Work-Based Learning Microcourse Series. Today's presentation will take a deep dive on the creation of a work-based learning activity from start to finish.
I think there are a few things worth saying before we look at the purpose and agenda of this session and then go forward from there. The first is that we deliberately chose this session to follow the one that came before. Actually, if you had seen the micro course calendar in an earlier incarnation of it, you would have seen that this session was supposed to come later. We moved it up in part because what preceded this was the design of a work-based learning scope and sequence. And we felt that led pretty naturally into this session in the sense that the work-based learning scope and sequence is the puzzle altogether. These are all of the parts fitting together the way you want them to, the way they need to. And then this session is more, now let's look at an individual piece. What makes an individual piece of the puzzle a piece of the puzzle? What's the shape? How is it cut? How does it fit into the ones around it? That felt like a pretty natural progression. And so if you haven't already, we absolutely suggest that you spend some time with the previous session's recordings, because I think you'll find that this one is a nice outgrowth of the one before and helps to fill in some of the skills and knowledge and thought processes around moving from your scope and sequence design to your activity design. The other thing I think that is worth pointing out about this particular session is that a deep dive is what we mean by deep dive. It's a kind of a moderate depth. We are diving deeper with the design of a work-based learning activity from start to finish than we probably ever have before, in the sense that we are going to look a little bit more closely about the considerations that come up at every step of the way in planning. But we're going to stop short of a certain kind or amount of depth, in the sense that we're not going to say to you, at this stage, this should happen. At this stage, this should happen. The reason being that we don't want any of these sessions to be overly prescriptive. The intention here is to suggest best practices, and to the extent that we can, shine a light on those best practices to help you take them and make them yours, and figure out what it means to do this work in the context of your school with your students and your team. And so to say, in a very kind of fine-grained way, do this and then do this and then do this, or these are the very, kind of fine and precise steps that the design of a work-based learning activity is made of, would feel artificial. It would feel false. It doesn't really work for your culture, for your structure, for everything that happens in your school. So the depth is kind of a moderate depth. It's deep enough to say, here's the process as we see it, but not so deep as to then kind of nudge you toward the specific actions that bring that process to life in your school. That is yours to decide and yours to carry out.
So the purpose is to illustrate the thought process of creating a work-based learning activity from the selection, the planning, the follow-through, and the follow-up to help you with your implementation of the activities that you need. As a part of today's agenda, we will provide a visualization of the before and after in the creation of a work-based learning activity, a timeline of questions that should present itself as planning from the conception to the evaluation phase of the activity. And then we'll also share a spotlight on the work-based learning activity from the partnership coordinator, Melissa Giroux, from the Urban Assembly Maker Academy, of their workplace challenge. And then finally, share some thoughts on mutual benefits.
Larry had mentioned when walking us through the agenda that we would begin with a visualization of the before and after of the big day, the day of the work-based learning activity. This is a very brief couple of slides. It's not very content heavy. It's really just meant to provide a way to visualize that a work-based learning activity is, when it happens and when it happens well, it's this thing of beauty that comes and goes. If it is a one day activity, it begins and ends on the same day, and then it's done, and then it's gone. It could be more of multi-day or multi-week activity if it's a workplace challenge or an internship. But at any rate, all of this is to say that the activity itself, it kind of, the metaphor that comes to mind is that the duck on the water image, where what you see is very graceful, and what you don't see beneath the waterline is a lot of paddling. So we have this big day, this work-based learning activity, and then if we go to the next slide, we can see that what it kind of conceals or belies is all of this work that happens before and after. There's so much visioning, planning, communication, and preparation that comes before the work-based learning activity. We'll speak to that in the next few slides. And then afterwards, right, because when it ends, it's just, that's not it. That's not the end. How did it go? Why did it go the way it went? What did we learn from how it went? What do we need to do with that information? Those considerations are all there as well. So there is these threads coming out of the event on both ends, things leading into it and things leading out of it. And we see in the next slide that that's just not a matter of logistics and planning and lining up material resources and lining up the right players and stakeholders. It's also got this kind of thread, this kind of narrative through line that has to do with the students' experience of the work-based learning. Everything that they have done to this point, ideally, if you have done your scope and sequence planning and you have created a bigger picture for the journey that the students are on in their work-based learning, the trajectory that they experience, then it very much is the case that the work-based learning that they've had before will have developed skills, knowledge, frames of mind, habits of mind, exposure to ideas. All of those things will have teed up what comes in this next work-based learning activity. And this work-based learning activity will then tee up what happens next. So there's a logistical through line, and then there's an experiential through line as well for the students themselves.
And of course, thanks, Joe. And of course, that brings a timeline of questions for our WBL activities, which we will explore its deeper content. But just to go through it in series, why this activity and not a different one? What is the purpose and how do I achieve it? What do I need to do between now and then? What happens the week of or day of? And how did it go and what comes next? And of course, there are other questions that we can come up with, but these are some questions that you should be thinking of as you're creating your WBL activity. And Joe did mention something a few slides ago. A lot of these questions that we come up with for this presentation are determined. I think a part of the thought process is what is the culture of your school and who are the students that you're serving, which is why some of these questions are going to be applicable for some coordinators and others, and other questions for other coordinators. The questions as it stands are not in while they are in a sequence format, some questions may be more applicable to some coordinators than others, but these are some of the questions that you should be thinking about, and we'll take a deeper dive into each of those questions.
Yeah, and I'll say this, the reason why we're framing them as questions is precisely what we said earlier about this kind of moderate deep dive, where it's deep enough to show the process in action, but not so deep that it's kind of prescribing or dictating the terms of the process for you. Rather than say, do this now, do this now, do this now, we felt it was probably more appropriate and more helpful to say, at this point, here's the question you can be asking. And the answers that it surfaces will provide you with the information that you need and the sense of what to do next that your school and your work-based learning activities require. And so one way to look, we can go to the next slide and look at, for example, what exists in this first question when we begin to tease it out. Why this activity and not a different one? Another way of saying that is, why have this activity at all? Right? I mean, there's an infinite number of work-based learning activities you can choose from. And so there has to be some basis of selection. There has to be some reason to say, we want this activity and not that one. So why this activity? why the particular activity you have in mind. A couple of things, or more than a couple of things, actually inform that selection. First and foremost, your scope and sequence, right? Your scope and sequence is the thing that delineates the journey of work-based learning that your students will have from the time they're in ninth grade and they enter the school until graduation. That is a whole path that involves experiences that build on one another. And so if these experiences are building on one another, then in this particular moment in time, let's say you find yourself, late 10th grade, you're planning a work-based learning activity. Which activity am I going to choose? Well, you have to look at what came before and what's going to come after on the basis of the journey that your scope and sequence lays out.
Well, I think too, a lot of this, there's some future forecasting that needs to happen as well. Just knowing the landscape of your industry, knowing the students that you are serving. And I think for our first bullet point, the right experience at the right time, some of those factors are going to determine what you roll out as an activity, right? Which is why I think it made a lot of sense to do this presentation right after the scope and sequence, because now you get to look back at the scope and sequence and figure out what makes sense. And if we're doing this if we're starting off for students in the ninth grade, um, this is probably the place that you want to start, and it's going to help you inform what activities I should be rolling out to ninth grade students, but still applicable for all grade levels. But if we're looking for a place of inception, I think just starting at the ninth grade, that would be the perfect. I think that's the perfect resource, tool that you should be using to answer some of those questions.
Yeah. And there are other factors as well, including what the industry partners are willing and able to offer. And an example of that would be, let's say it is ninth grade and you want to have some kind of industry exposure, work-based learning experience for your students. And what you have in mind is a site visit of some kind. But for your partners are telling you that the site is unvisitable for some reason right now, or there's something that makes that unfeasible or impossible for the partner. Or let's say if it's a medical pathway, there's a HIPAA consideration of exposing students to actual patients having actual medical issues that is making the partner say, well, maybe we can't do a site visit right here, right now at this moment in time, but we can do a guest speaker series where different professionals from this institution come in and sit with students and talk to them about what their background is, what a day in the life of their job is. And that's an illustration of how, what a partner can do and wants to do sometimes also helps to dictate the selection of the activity. I should say this, I think your relationship with your partner is a constant negotiation, and it's guided by primarily the needs of the students. What do the students need in terms of industry awareness and training? And that's the partner's wheelhouse. They know that better than you. And then what do the students need in terms of engagement, igniting their thinking, the pedagogy of the experience, what's going to promote learning? And in that case, that's more in your wheelhouse, usually, not exclusively, but often that's more in your wheelhouse than it may be in the industry partners. And so you have to combine this know-how, and the partners will say that they're willing and able to do X because they believe it promotes the industry knowledge or skills. And you may find that it's not necessarily as offered, it's not necessarily the activity with the right pedagogy for your students. And so that's a negotiation, that's a conversation. You have to tweak it and determine sort of where those two things cross, where they ideally will come up with the right work-based learning activity.
But I think also the questions that we laid out through this process, they're meant to be thought-provoking questions, right? And they're also meant to, and I think they're even layered, because with why this activity and not this activity, with each bullet point that we've laid out with each factor that we've laid out, they're going to bring up more questions. And some of these questions you're going to be able to answer on your own, but a lot of it is going to it's going to mean that you're going to have to gather information, and you're going to have to gather information from all of your stakeholders. You're going to have to gather information from your students. You're going to have to be in contact with your industry partners, because I think, like Joe mentioned earlier, what if my students can't go to the site? So now, instead of me going back to the drawing board, I'm communicating with my industry partner to figure out how we can do something different for our students. And maybe the opportunity to visit the site comes later, but we don't want students to lose out on an experience altogether. So there are things that can be done. And this is going to be the stage where a lot of this information gathering happens.
A lot of what you see in this slide is somewhat self-explanatory in terms of, time resources, material resources, funding. These are all things that can determine, they shouldn't be determining, they shouldn't be the things that ultimately decide what the work-based learning activity looks like. Like we said, kind of the primary determinant should be, what do the students need at this point in time, and then the what does that actually look like, the kind of the tweaking of the what, the where, the how, the why, that can also be shaped by funds, material resources, time resources, etc. So a lot of this is pretty intuitive. The thing I want to point out is this last bullet, this whether all or part of the activity is being coordinated for you, right? And so increasingly in recent years, there have been these centrally developed citywide work-based learning offerings. And I think in many ways they're fantastic, because they do things that a lone work-based learning coordinator operating by themselves in a school sometimes couldn't possibly dream of coordinating on their own at that scale and with that level of, flourish, and with the all of the resources going into them. Like, it's really, in some ways, it's a dream to have these activities to be able to offer your students. The downside is, you don't necessarily always see what's happening in them, right? There's sort of, your school is a recipe, right? You're cooking up something for your students and you're serving it over a number of years. And, a citywide or a work-based learning offering that's coming from someone else that you don't have a hand in coordinating is basically a way of saying, in the middle of that experience, now go to this other person's house for dinner and come back and tell us how that was and what you need, what will nourish you next. No issue with that. It's, you just have to pay attention to the ways that these opportunities developed and offered outside of your school's own kind of planning and implementation agenda and style. What's happening in them, and how do they connect to the things that you're doing in your school, right? So it's a benefit in that a lot of the burden of planning is taken off your shoulders. It could be a cost in the sense that you sometimes don't have visibility into what's actually happening there, and that experience as a result can be a little bit disjointed in terms of what happens with and for the student. It might be kind of like they're in your school, they go to this other place, they come back, and it's sort of like the channel has changed a couple of times, and you need to do a little bit more work to kind of weave those things together, as they would have been if you had been planning them all from the start. So it's a good thing to keep in mind that these things are out there and to take advantage of them. I think we have found that ideally a lot of schools do well when they blend these things, when there's a lot of homegrown work-based learning that they have developed on the ground themselves with their partners, with their CTE team, with their teachers, with all the stuff that just comes from, that is generated by the partnership between the industry folks and the school, and these things that are just kind of offered from without, that the city is saying, here's some work-based learning that we're offering to multiple schools. A blend of those things actually creates a nice mix of experiences, and also enables you to kind of, sort of play with your own workload a little bit better. There will be some things that you have to put a lot of work into, and some things you can put less into as a result of having that mix.
So, what is the purpose and how do I achieve it? Things to take into account. What is the purpose and how do I achieve it? Once again, these are things that are not prescriptive, but just things that you should be thinking about during the process. So, what you want your students to take away from the experience, from the activity. industry exposure, the concrete skills, critical knowledge, others, and there's so much more. But part of this goes with putting students at the center of the activity itself. And for me, what I'm always going to suggest is once you know your students, just knowing what you want them to get out of the experience, because I think that's going to determine the type of industry exposures that you create for them.
These examples you see in parentheses in this first bullet, industry exposure, concrete skills, critical knowledge, it's not one of these things or another. Oftentimes they will exist in a work-based learning activity as a mix. In fact, what I would encourage you to do, if you have a sort of a framework of everything that your work-based learning is meant to deliver in the way of skills, knowledge, habits of mind, etc., who do you want your students to be at the end of this work-based learning sequence? If you have that framework in mind, you might consider each individual component as itself a little bit of a dial, right, that you turn up or turn down. And so any given work-based learning activity will be a snapshot of these dials turned to a different level. It could be that, and you'll see that, in the beginning of work-based learning for a younger student, the exposure dials will be turned way up. Everything having to do with getting students in an introduction to certain ideas, concepts, and skills, initial engagement, the beginnings of know-how, familiarity with the industry, those dials are turned up. And then maybe the dials that have more to do with deeper level skills and the kinds of skills that get assessed, say, for example, in a credentialing exam for an industry certification, those dials are turned up more toward the end. But any work-based learning activity, though, you'll have a set of dials that are your essential skills, ideas, concepts, etc. Figure out where the dials are turned for that particular activity, and that will dictate what happens in the course of the activity.
And I'm going to jump around a little bit, but I also think that who's involved in this process is going to determine the level of engagement for your student, right? If you, as the work-based learning coordinator, if you're the only person that is involved in this process, um, and I hope there's a way for it not to come off so harsh, but I think if you're doing this by yourself, it's the experience is going to come off more as a to-do and not really an experience. Um, if if I'm able, and some of the words that I like to use is buy-in. For example, if we're talking about parents, letting the parents know what the experience is all about is going to be important because now you have a stakeholder that can reinforce the message of these activities for the students, and it lets them know how important it is to them. Parents is I think it's definitely crucial that you get parents on board as the stakeholders in this process so that it's not just an activity, but it really is an experience. And I think that's the difference is that we're not just right now, I think for this presentation, we're looking at creating an activity, but this activity is just one piece of a whole experience, right? So you definitely want to make sure that parents are included in all of this because you're going to need you're going to need partners that are able to reinforce the message to the students so that they don't just see this as a standalone activity. We want this to build out from an activity into an experience.
There are two other things I want to point out quickly about this slide. One is that you'll notice that a lot of what's here, these considerations, echo or mirror the considerations from the previous slide, which makes sense. The kind of the selecting the activity broadly speaking and what goes into that. And then once the basic shape of the activity is chosen, the process of giving it more shape, giving it more structure, actually kind of more precisely defining the purpose and then structuring, creating, designing the activity from there, those are sort of part of the same process. And so a lot of what you see here, or some of what you see here, is somewhat redundant in terms of the things that you're thinking about. The why, and then therefore the what, and then therefore the how. The second thing I want to point out is that what feels really important to me in this slide is this third bullet of take into account the student experience of the activity, what they are doing, hearing, seeing, trying, etc. One way to help yourself not get into a position where you've designed a work-based learning activity and then the day it's implemented, you're in this position of, oh my God, I forgot to think of X, Y, and Z. Once the activity starts to happen and you see students on the ground experiencing it and you see kind of gaps, big gaps in their experience, one way to prevent that is to kind of give yourself a sort of like a video game avatar of a student in your mind, right? Think of and maybe an actual student in your school, and think of from the minute the activity starts, hypothetically in your head, this activity that you're envisioning, from the minute it starts, what is this young person experiencing? What are they hearing? What are they doing? That will also help you kind of fine tune some of the appropriateness of the activity in terms of when there are things that they're hearing or content that they're receiving, how are they feeling? Is it content that they can synthesize and process well? Is it content that's kind of um, uh, that combines some things they already know with some things they don't know yet? So there's this kind of mix of kind of challenge and mastery there. Is it engaging them? Is it too much to receive? Is it too much kind of frontal content, too little? Like, you can be in that student's head and hear the content that they're going to hear and fine tune it. And then also the same thing with what they're doing, um, how they're going to actually be asked to engage in an activity. Be that student in your head. If they're asked to do this, can they do it? What aspects will be challenging? What won't? Is the challenge appropriate? Is it too much? Is it too little? So all of this is to say that if you kind of choose a student and kind of try to inhabit sensorily their experience of the activity from the moment it starts, you will be able to not only anticipate much more clearly than you otherwise would have been able to anticipate the actual steps of the activity, what goes into it, and how it unfolds. But you'll also be able to kind of right size those pieces as far as making sure that the content of it neither is not challenging enough for the students, nor too challenging for them in a way that's going to, um, put them in a place where they're not receiving it because it's what they don't know actually far exceeds and surpasses what they do.
So now that you've determined which activity you're planning, taken into consideration all the factors in your decision, and figured out what you are trying to achieve with this activity, it's time to start the planning phase of your activity. This is where all the important things happen behind the curtain that no one gets to see. Start early and go step by step. Do well in advance what needs doing well in advance. So, and this is going to include nailing down the dates, location, times, etc. These are things. These are things that are probably need to happen. These are things that need to happen well in advance of your activity. Securing the funds needed, lined up other resources. Securing funds is probably a big item, especially school facing. And I don't know how you feel about that, Joe, but usually you'd like to make sure that you have the okay from administration when it comes to funds. You don't want to wait till the last minute to discuss those things with your administration. And just make sure you have the people that you need. Everyone that needs to be involved should be involved as you're processing through the dates, locations, and times. One of the things that you don't want to run into is setting a location for your activity, but then there's a conflict because whether it's a room at your school or maybe conflict on at the industry partner site, you just want to make sure that everything is checked, but then you also want to go back and check it again and double check it just to make sure that everything is set in place.
Yeah, and we'll get to that in the next slide when we talk about, building in redundancies and things like that. But planning in advance enables you to actually have a process in which redundancies are there if you need them. You can double confirm and triple confirm, etc. As for the doing well in advance, what needs doing well in advance, this is going to vary, and it's going to be somewhat based upon your knowledge of the moving parts of your school and your partner and how quickly or slowly those moving parts move, right? If you have a partner that you know to be somewhat slow to respond, or that needs a couple of different prompts, a couple of different proddings in order to respond, then you know that outreach begins earlier than you otherwise would begin it. If your school has a budget process, to Larry's point, where getting funds requested, approved, and then disbursed is a very long process, you start that well in advance. That might not be the case in your school. In your school, it could be that the work-based learning program has a preset budget that is given to you to spend when you need it, and you have the dexterity to requisition that money somewhat instantly. If that's the case, then that's not going to be a well in advance thing for you. So look at all the pieces that you have in front of you, and then based on your knowledge of the culture and the structure in front of you, what needs to happen first, and then what can happen from there.
So I'm looking at the second one, planning the activity as you might plan a lesson. And this run right here, it requires a lot of backwards planning, I think. Ultimately, you want to ask yourself, what am I trying to accomplish with this activity, right? Immediately, it makes me think of, and I'll be a little nostalgic here. This makes me think of a Michael Jackson track. This makes me think of We Are the World, right? Songs like that don't just come together. It starts off with an idea, it starts off with a plan. And then here you have these 30 amazing artists that you bring into a room, and you don't just ask them to sing the song. Everyone needs direction.
Mhm.
Everyone needs to know everyone does something special. And this is the time where the person who's creating the song is actually interacting with all 30 people in the song to say, hey, this is what you do well, Bruce Springsteen. This is what I need you to do. This is what you do well, Cindy Lauper. This is what I need you to do in
Yeah.
the song so that we can create one cohesive song. Ultimately, before any of that happens, you want to envision what the end goal is. What are you trying to accomplish as you're creating this activity? Because to the next point, you want to make sure that it's structured and there's a flow so that it's cohesive and it's fluid. So you also want to make sure that the how suits the what.
Yeah. This, in some respects, this feels like the most important slide of this session. Not that the previous two weren't important. The previous two were the why and the what. And certainly there, I think in a lot of ways they matter the most. But we've been there in the course of this micro course that we've been doing together. We've talked a lot about purpose and vision and why, and then how the what should match the why. We've spent comparatively little time talking about the how and the when and the where. And this is the part that's easy to forget, particularly since it can feel on any given day, especially in a school building, it can feel really counterinstinctive to sit down and devote your time and your thought and your energy to something that is going to come to fruition weeks from now, right? It feels so much more natural to deal with what's in front of you, to put out the fires, as they say sometimes. Like, when I meet with folks in schools and they're putting out fires, all valid, all well and good, and there's certainly a lot to be done. But as a result, this work, this proactive rather than the reactive work, the work of piece by piece creating something that's going to happen days, weeks, maybe even months from now, it's easy to choose against, or it's easy to not choose when the easier and the more present and visible, and in some ways urgent and immediate choice is to just kind of do something that involves like something that's happening right now and an immediate need. Great, attend to those needs, but also please make sure um, that you are building time into your day to actually do the proactive work that the future fruits that your work-based learning program is going to bear, that it needs, that fruit will require, and it will thank you for the advanced work that you put in.
I think you're right when you say that this is the most important slide. And I'm going to go to preparing the key players and then go right back to planning the activity because and this is just to set the stage a little bit. Imagine you create an activity with your industry partner that you have 30 students and you've planned an activity where you're supposed to go to the industry partner site. And you get to the site and you have 30 kids with you and maybe you have to go into a building and there's a scramble because Your teacher is talking to the person at the door, and you need 30 tags for all the students to get in, but maybe the person at the front door doesn't have your school on the list, right? Okay, we get the students situated, we go upstairs, and they're not set with the activity. So there's a little bit of wait time, 15-minute wait time. What I want you guys to keep in mind is that your students will take notice of something that is being put together versus something that's already put together. Something that's put together feels welcoming, and students, I think, can see that from the entrance, from the start of the activity into the activity and the end of the activity. They'll be able to tell whether or not this is authentic or not. The only way for this to be authentic is to make sure that you've prepared all of the key players across the board. You want to make sure that everybody that's involved in this process has all the information that they need.
To that, I would add that, and to your point, Larry, students feel cared for when they see that a coordinated event has been created for them. If they're in the midst of an environment where people don't have the information they need, or somebody's late, or it just kind of feels a little bit like it's being thrown together, that's going to send a message. So yeah, I agree with you, Larry, 100%. And the last thing that I would say about this slide, and again, it sort of drills down a point that you were making. This last point here, communicate, maybe even over communicate. It might feel a little unnatural, and it might actually feel like you are pestering people. And to be honest, you'll get a feel over time for who needs over communication and who doesn't. Some people, they got it on the first time. And that about them, and you can be comparatively more trusting that they're going to carry their piece through. Other people, through no fault of their own, right? This isn't a blame game, but maybe they're juggling a lot and they just need messaging more and more often, right? It's better to have, say, for example, a partner say to you, like, yep, I got that. You already told me about my role once and I got it. And thank you, thanks for that information, but I'm good. Than to have a partner show up at an activity, not know what to do, and say, I never got that information about my role. Better to over communicate than to under communicate. One thing I want to say about this slide off the bat is that this first bullet point here of doing a mental walkthrough to visualize the activity from start to finish, it kind of belongs in the previous slide. We put it here because I think we're getting closer to the activity actually happening. It's so much more in the air, and it's about to come to pass, and kind of doing that visualization to kind of confirm all the final details, nail down all the final logistics. Like, that's very important at this stage. But also it can be said that at the previous stage, when you're still maybe kind of weeks out, especially for a more complex or longer term work-based learning activity, doing that visualization, that mental walkthrough, and doing it with another person, right? You could do it by yourself. That's certainly productive. But if you have, maybe, it's the CTE teacher, or maybe it's, assistant principal, somebody you work with who you can sit down with and say, all right, let's talk this through. What happens? Where do things begin? What happens next? What happens next? That it's important at any stage, this one and the previous one. But it will certainly, what it will do, as much of an anticipatory mind as you have, as capable as you are of thinking in advance about how an event is going to go and what needs to happen in order to bring that off. Like, you're bound to forget things, and so the mental walkthrough is one of the best ways to start to better anticipate what has to now been possibly unanticipated.
And I think that some of these can be seen as to your point, some of this I think can be seen as a continuation from the last slide. And I think the order of some of these bullets may be different depending on who the coordinator is, right? Because, for example, I am the type of person who I want to make sure if I'm planning something, I want to make sure that I have everything in place, and I also want to make sure that I speak to all of my key stakeholders before I do my mental walkthrough. Um, because for me, the mental walkthrough is probably the next to final stage of before it's showtime, right? After I receive confirmation from everyone and I have the logistics in my head. But there are other people who maybe they need to do that mental walkthrough because either they're going to visualize this in their mind or they're going to put this all down on paper to see what makes sense, right? So once
Yeah.
you put it down on paper to see what makes sense and you have it mapped out in front of you, then maybe you're going to make your confirmations with all your players in terms of logistics, especially to see if anything has changed or if there's something that needs to be included, right? Just to make sure that your vision can actually come to fruition.
Yeah, same thing with creating a buzz, right? That can happen the
Hmm.
week of. It can also happen 3 weeks before. I mean, it depends. There's such a thing as too early a buzz, but it all depends on what the activity is and how early a set of preparatory activities, including creating a buzz. I would say the same thing with creating a buzz, right? That can happen the week of, it can happen 3 weeks before. It all depends on the nature of the activity. Would it benefit from some early buzz? There's such a thing as a buzz that's too early. Depends on the activity. Or is it the kind of thing that the week of, it really that crescendo moment is called for? Um, I would go on to say that with these last two bullets here, these felt important to include because I think the frame of mind for running the work-based learning activity is so important. And whether or not you have spent a lot of time and effort planning the activity, but especially if you have, when it's actually happening, that impulse to make sure that things go well is going to be incredibly strong, as well it should be. I think a good or a strong work-based learning activity benefits from somebody who has a bit of that kind of like the vigilance to watch over it and see that all the pieces are falling into place. That being said, too tight a grip on the activity can squeeze the life out of it a little bit. And you're not necessarily going to have any fun. The students might feel like the activity is encumbered by a set of by heavy structures or too much expectation or too tight a script or too rigid a sense of how things ought to move. So there is, I think in a way there is this balance to hit between having that kind of like that watchfulness, ushering the activity along, but also, it's kind of at that point where I put in all the work. What's going to happen is going to happen, and my job is to flow with it and respond to it as it unfolds. And that requires a little bit more kind of lightness, and you kind of dance through the activity in a way. You maintain that agility. So it is very much a balance.
I will say I want to go back to the creating a buzz bullet because for me it's important because and you mentioned it. Um, Creating a buzz can be a week early, can be 3 weeks early, right? I think it depends on who you're creating the buzz for. So creating there's creating the buzz for the students, and then there's creating the buzz for the staff, right? And I want to, in my mind, I won't create a buzz with students a week prior to the activity. I'm probably going to create a buzz with the students maybe a month out of the event and just give them a little something to work up to leading to that event just because I want it fresh on their minds. I mean, that's one approach. That's me with school staff. I'm thinking that I am going to not necessarily create a buzz with school staff, but more so create awareness, right? At least I'll call it creating awareness with the staff because I don't want you as staff to feel like this is something that just sprung up on you, right? I want to make sure to give you time so that you can also reinforce it to your students, right? You want to make sure that they're all participating. You want to get them excited. You want them to buy into this. So for me, I think it depends on who your stakeholder is in terms of creating that buzz. Um, because for me, maybe the parents maybe you give them a week or two, you create the buzz with the parents by sending something home to the parents to let them know that this event is coming up. If parents are not a part of the planning phase, then maybe they should be a part of the phase where you're in the informing phase, if that will. But I just think that depending on your stakeholder depends on the duration in which I'm giving in creating that buzz. That
Yeah,
makes sense. So I think it's important.
yeah, the duration for sure, and then kind of when it begins, when it ends. Um,
Yeah.
that said, I will say there's definitely a case to be made for the 11th hour buzz, and the story I'll tell about that is when I was working for the Urban Assembly School for Law and Justice. One of the central activities that the ninth graders would do is they would develop opening statements in this fictitious dog bite trial, the trial of a dog that bit an SLJ student. And they would go to the law firm that we were partnered with, and they would deliver their opening statements to lawyers, and they would get warm feedback from the lawyers. It was very, the event had already a lot of buzz to it. We got to go to we're preparing these these statements. We're going to this law firm. It felt big. It felt important. It felt like it mattered.
Hmm.
Yet the night before the dog bite trial opening statements, I would, after everyone had gone home, I would plaster the hallways. I made all these signs, some of which were the dog that bit the student was named Fluffy in this fictitious case. And some of the signs were like anti-Fluffy. It was like, down with the hound, like who let the dog out? And some were pro-Fluffy, like free Fluffy, Fluffy was framed. And I would plaster the ninth grade hallway with these signs so
Hmm.
that when the ninth graders came in on the morning of the dog bite trial, they would see their hallway just kind of with this sort of like, kind of like the trial of the century type signage. It was just a fun little thing. It didn't really cost anything. It took a little bit of time, but it just added to the enthusiasm and to the sense of specialness.
But it gets the students curious because now you have questions. It's a disruptor because when you do something like that, it's a disruptor of a daily routine, right? So if you imagine not kids, students have a routine. Can you imagine getting students excited for an activity but you've plastered something on the hallway walls, right? It's different from what they're used to. Whether it's a new sign, whether it's whatever it is, it's different, and they're going to be curious and they're going to ask questions. Um, so I think it's important. All that to say that I think it's important.
I think the last thing that I would say about this slide, and we didn't actually make a dedicated slide about this particular thing, which is fine. I don't want to, I think minimal slides sometimes will be best in a session like this, but we considered briefly creating a slide that was about the distinction between, a longer and a shorter work-based learning activity. Because planning a guest speaker coming to the school and sitting down with a group of students and having lunch or doing mock interviews for an hour or 2 hours or whatever the case may be is very different from planning and implementing a 4-week workplace challenge or an 8-week internship, right? It's kind of logistically, the metaphor that comes to mind is the difference between, say, a restaurant and a hotel. You work at a restaurant, your guests come, they're there for a couple of hours and then they leave. So what goes into planning and delivering that experience is very different from at a hotel when, the client that's coming or the guest or whoever it is, they're there and they're not there for 2 hours, they're maybe there for 4 days.
Mhm.
You're delivering a longer experience that has to hit more notes, and that has a lot more complexity to it. That's going to take a different set of questions, a different set of concerns than just delivering that kind of one-time short staccato thing that begins and ends in the course of the same day. So, I would say week of, day of is not necessarily a relevant concept when the work-based learning activity in question is 4 weeks long. There's 4 weeks of week of, and having the patience and the stamina to continue to make it happen, right? By week 3, you've got to still have that same energy and that same attention to detail that you had in week 1, That's certainly a consideration worth mentioning, though we don't have it here in the slides. I definitely wanted to underscore it.
So we don't have it here in the slides, but let's go with that just for a quick second, right? You mentioned restaurant versus hotel, right? Um, and let's just think about the planning that goes into both just a little bit. When you go to a restaurant, your restaurant stay is usually a short stay. Um, I mean, if you're planning, you think about I don't know what type of restaurant this is, but you usually think about a patron's average time of stay. Average time it takes to cook the meal. What you're thinking about how to make their experience enjoyable in a matter of, let's say, 45 minutes versus the hotel stay. You have to prepare. Well, if a patron wants to stay at your hotel for 3 days, or maybe they want to stay for a full week, that takes a little bit more planning. But now I have to be, I have to be real. I have to be meticulous in terms of how am I going to make sure that their stay is enjoyable with us? What can I offer them during the course of the 3 days or the 7 days? And there's some things where if you're only staying for 2 days, maybe they pack everything in to make sure that you have the best experience possible. If you're staying for a week, then we have to figure out how can we take some of those pieces out so that it can stretch to the full week, right? But my point is between those two activities that you mentioned, there's a different set of planning that goes on, right? But you always have to, the one thing I think that's the same for both is you want to make sure that they have an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, not to belabor the metaphor, but I think, if there's somebody who's staying for a week at your hotel, they're not the same person on day six that they were on day one. On day
Very
six,
true.
they know the hotel better, they know that your city more, they know they know they're a little bit better situated in their experience and what they're seeing and what they're doing and what they want to keep seeing or what they want to like what new things they want to see. And much like with the students, in week 4 of a 4-week work-based learning experience, by week 4, you're not going to be delivering the same things that you were in week 1. Ideally, a 4-week experience is a 4-week experience because it entails some kind of arc of learning and then turning that learning into some kind of product or performance or demonstration or something where they're using what they know. And so what goes into week 4 is going to necessarily be different than what was in week 1. And that's of course
Very true.
something to build in at the front.
But
Or
now I have, and I think this is a good analogy, by the way, but because now with the restaurant, I have 45 minutes to make sure that you have the best experience possible. So it's up to me to figure out to determine what factors are going to help me to have the best experience, to have what factors are going to help my patrons have the best experience ever. And maybe it's customer service, or maybe I put all of my emphasis into the food. But for you, you have to decide what that's going to be for to speak to their experience.
Well, I think it's important to maybe pause right now and let
Hmm.
everyone know that we're gonna clearly you and I are having a lot of fun talking about this content, and ideally, and we're doing so not just for our own entertainment, but because we believe that um, there are things to be gleaned in the back and forth discussion of these points. Of these, we put these slides together to say, here's what we think goes into all of this, and then as we deliver this in this recording, you and I are just kind of bantering and going back and forth about different individual points here. If people can't stick with us for that, that's fine. If you need to take the slides and just kind of digest the core essential content, absolutely people should feel free to do that. And anyone who kind of wants to sit with us in this conversation, in and these deeper dives into these finer points, if you have the time, please do, because that's what we're here for.
Yep. So how did it go and what comes next? So in other words, how this activity concludes may inform how the next one begins and unfolds. I actually had another way of viewing that. How this activity ends determines whether or not the students come back. And for, I mean, and even if your students do come back, are your students going to be happy about going through another experience?
Are you still
right?
extending that restaurant and hotel metaphor?
No, I'm not, but I mean,
Sounds like it.
it does sound like it. It does sound like it. I mean, and as you're reading this slide, and if you are thinking about that metaphor, the first thing I thought about was Yelp.com, because after you had an experience, there has to be a way for you to say, "Hey, this was a great experience." You'll be able to tell by your students' reaction during your next activity on whether or not they enjoyed the first one. But all of this is going to depend on how your first activity has concluded. And I think in a lot of respects, your first activity should probably be open ended, right? You don't want it to end as the end all be all. You want it to lead into something else. So, what students now know or can do will be the basis of the next steps they take.
So Larry, to your point about Yelp, this puts me in mind of the people I know who own businesses they have
Mhm,
a very complex relationship with Yelp. Um, the good reviews are appreciated. The bad reviews can stir sort of fear and anxiety in the heart, particularly the bad reviews that aren't necessarily constructive. They don't say like you maybe this could go better. The reviews sometimes will just say like this was terrible or I hated this experience, and that can make a person um, resistant to even soliciting that feedback in the first place. So all of which is to say, I think it's important for folks to. I think we all know that really this all comes down to what experience uh, is the student having, and how do we know, and what can we do for them if they're not having the right student? Like that's what's at the heart of all of this.
mhm,
But the reluctance to ask the student how it went could come from the fear of hearing the negative feedback, or the fear that, oh my God, I just put all this time and effort and energy into
mhm.
planning the wrong activity, into planning something that didn't have the intended effect. If at all possible, I would like to, as counterintuitive as it feels, I would like to encourage folks to see that as good information, as good data, because it tells you what you need to know to better serve the students going forward.
I think that, and I agree with you. I think that if you were to do a WBL assessment where you're asking a student, did you like this activity? Yes or no? I think you would be doing yourself a disservice, even if you got 30 out of 30 responses that said yes,
Hmm.
right? I and not to move away from this a little bit, but it's with my son who's in pre-K. I ask him every day. I say, "How was school?" He says, "Good, good." And we attended a parent-teacher conference where the administrators taught us. They said, instead of asking your child, "How was your day?" which elicits that one-word answer, you can ask them, "What was the best part of your day? What was the worst part of your day?" Right? In this instance, it's not so much of a yes or no. It's what was the best part of this work-based learning activity, and what parts of this work-based learning activity can be improved. Because what you want to do is generate more than just that one word answer. And I think we as assessment administrators, we have to be open to critique when it comes to us in that form, because it's not for us, it's for the students. So we just want to make sure that we're receiving a lot of this information as it's critical information that we need in order to improve on the activities that we have for the students. So for me, that's something that I would probably harp on is try not to create assessments that elicit that one word answer. You want students to be descriptive about their experience. And you also want to give them an opportunity to share what might not have been the bright spots for them.
Yeah. I will say it feels to me that maybe an elephant in the room in looking at this slide is what a close observer might say, reading this first bullet. If how this activity concludes informs how the next one begins and unfolds, then how on earth can I possibly have a work-based learning scope and sequence that is written and formulated and constructed in advance, right? If the idea is that one activity's assessment informs what happens in the next one, if that's the idea, then how can we plan out a whole scope and sequence? In other words, how can I map out a student's entire journey if being a responsible guide to that journey means seeing what are their first steps, and based on that, what are their second steps, and based on that, what are their third steps? And I think the answer to that is it's kind of both and, right? On the one hand, you know that students are going to surprise you and they're going to proceed in their way and at their pace. And that's going to call for some tweaks and adjustments. Maybe the work-based learning calendar moves more quickly than you initially thought it would, or less quickly. But all of that is to say it's still okay, not just okay, but appropriate and necessary to have in mind what the trajectory of learning can be, right? Particularly if you're working with an industry partner and the industry partner is aware that people in the industry have tended to learn a certain set of things a certain way and in a certain order, and it doesn't suit every learner, but the general, if the basics are there, that kind of like the building blocks of the cumulative learning experience are there, that's what the scope and sequence exists to state outright and to put down on paper and to have visually in front of you. It's not to say that these blocks are complete in and of themselves and they're never going to move and they're never going to shrink or expand, or they're never going to include different skills or differently taught skills than we initially thought. Like that editability ought to be there and is largely based on the outcomes of assessments. But you also can know the fundamentals of a particular learning journey.
But I think, and I couldn't have said it any better, but your plans can't be made of concrete, like they need to be made of some moldable clay or something that you can shape at any given time, because students plans change, your plans may change, but what's important to all of this is that you're coming into this with a plan, right? You come in with a plan, and then as you're engaging with students, as you're engaging with parents, industry partners, your own staff, administration, at least you have something to come back to now that you've received input from all of these stakeholders and you're able to make adjustments as necessary, right? Um, put that up against you coming in with a solid concrete plan where none of the pieces can be moved. Now you put yourself between a rock and a hard place, right? So it's great to have a plan that you can look back on and say, yes, this is going to work. But I think you should also have in the back of your mind that things may change, and also keep in mind that, hey, listen, you know what? Just because I have this piece at step one and this piece at step three, that doesn't necessarily mean that I can't change those things around. You can definitely change them, um, depending on the landscape, the culture, and the students that you're servicing at your school.
And you probably will change them, right? I mean, I
Yeah.
think a scope and sequence that has been in place for a few years has probably ironed out a lot of the wrinkles. But, when the first time you implement your scope and sequence, the first time you implement an activity, you're going to learn a lot about how that actually could have gone. You will be able to fine tune it, and that will involve probably a necessary shift in what happens and the order in which it happens. I don't think that there's not necessarily a need to kind of spend too much time talking about the bottom part of this slide that talks about what the features or aspects of a quote unquote appropriate work-based learning assessment are. These are going to be probably familiar to a lot of people, and some are liable to get emphatic nods of agreement, particularly when it comes to not collapsing students to data points. And others are kind of think pieces, like these are it tells you where to go next with your students. Okay, how does it do that? In what way?
As we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we're going to share a spotlight on a work-based learning activity that was presented to us by Melissa Giroux, who is the partnership coordinator at the Urban Assembly Maker Academy. Um, as we're listening to Melissa map out her WBL activity, some questions to consider. What reasons does Melissa identify for choosing this particular activity? What will be the benefits for the students, the school, and the partners? And based on what we've heard about the purpose and the structure of the activity and the partners' roles, what kinds of planning steps do you imagine it will take to carry out this activity successfully?
Yeah, that third bullet is particularly important because that's really sort of the fruits of the thinking that we've done together in this particular session. Everything that we've talked about in the previous slides comes down to this moment. Melissa talks us really beautifully through some of the features of the program and why she's running it, and what it looks like. And I think maybe as viewers, as listeners, it can be our job to kind of use what we've heard today in the previous slides and think about, all right, what would it take? What does it mean to consider what we have to do between now and then, between the moment the idea is had and the successful launch of the activity? You know, what's the ahead of time stuff, the well in advance stuff? What's the week of stuff? What's the day of stuff? That can be on us to consider. And I definitely want to shout out Melissa for doing this for us. I do need to say it was a pretty busy week for Melissa, as it is for all of you. I'm sure every week is a busy week. And Melissa made time to do this for us. And, while she was doing so, said that she felt it was really important to encourage this kind of discussion and learning between practitioners. So thank you, Melissa, for seeing this as an important contribution to your colleagues, and thank you for helping us out here and for providing this walkthrough of your activity.
We're going to be talking today about the Urban Assembly Maker Academy, a workplace challenge that we're running this spring in partnership with SUNY FIT and an architect and interior designer. Thanks for listening in. First, some introductions. My name is Melissa Giroux. I am the partnership coordinator for UA Maker, and I'm running this program in collaboration with Jerry Irizarry, who is our work-based learning coordinator and CTE teacher. He's not participating in the audio recording of this because, as many of you know, work-based learning coordinators are also full-time staff. And I'd say, just to dive right in at the beginning to some tips and tricks, we've delegated out ourselves some pretty specific roles when it comes to these projects in general. All of the workplace challenges and internships we run, I tend to do more of the communication work with external partners and structuring what it looks like for students to come in and out of the building, and communication with parents, while Jerry's focused more on the content of the projects and what skills are being assessed and making sure they connect back to our CTE tracks. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about our project overview and the need for this project, how it came up. Then we'll dive into collaboration with FIT and this professor who's been a partner of ours now. We'll talk about the skills that the students are working on and how they're working on them. I'll show some photos and discuss how the challenge has gone through in action. And then we'll talk about what happens next and where we'll take this in the future. So our project is that our building has 3 corner alcoves, as you can see in this drawing, that was made by students and staff. Each of the stairwells out of the building has a little corner alcove, and those are also our only sources of real natural light. We have big floor-to-ceiling windows there, but they're spaces that aren't really particularly used. It's just sort of a quiet space in the corner of each hallway. Sometimes it becomes a hangout area. Sometimes it's where we leave laptop carts, but it's not super functional space. So in those spaces, each of the teams of workplace challenge participants will be developing design solutions to think about how to use those corner alcoves as more useful space, activated space. So they'll do interviews, they'll come up with names and themes, and propose all the different elements that would help us use those spaces as more classroom, lounge, galleries, other types of school space. And the need for this project really came through in talking with students and staff this year. We have increasing enrollment, and we don't have enough space. We're using, as many of you probably are, closets for offices and multiple people sharing spaces. And so we need more space. We need space for pullouts. We need places for students to meet with counselors or other staff. And so that was like the real urgent need. And then we also have a need with between COVID and the later end of our school days, it's harder and harder to get students out in the world doing workplace challenge and internships. So we're trying to run more of them on site at our school. Our school day doesn't end until 3:40, which makes it tough sometimes to get to after school internship programs. And as you all know, COVID has changed what it looks like to go into office spaces, particularly for students who are not vaccinated in some cases. So this project came about through collaboration with a new partner who we brought on earlier this year. His name is Eric Daniels. He's a practicing architect and interior designer, and he's also a professor at FIT. He came to our school through another connection, was referred to us as a potential partner. And when we met him the first time, we said, let's test it out small. Come to our school, maybe run a workshop, a one-off experience, a career talk, for him to get to know us and us to get to know him. And that's another tip I would throw out there for folks is start small. When you meet a new partner, or there's someone you want to engage with, definitely don't jump right into a 12-week internship. This gave him the opportunity to see how our students are and how our staff works, and also what it looks like for our students to work with him and make sure that it felt like an appropriate partnership for everyone. I would also say really quickly that this is a mutually beneficial project. This is something that as we got talking with Eric, we realized that he needed something to connect his students to, a similar sort of workplace challenge idea, but at the college level. And so it was something that was easy for both of us to commit to because it benefited both of our programs. And I would also say that we wanted to make sure that it's something that's tied to our CTE team's longer goals, which are incorporating new courses, potentially in furniture design. We have a lot of students interested in interior design, and we've been getting that feedback. And so this sort of meets both student interests and needs and our long-term project scope in terms of how we want to adapt our CTE team. The skills that we are assessing through this project really connect to our digital media and design pathway. There's design studio and prototyping courses that are taught by Jerry, who I mentioned earlier. And these are some of the skills that we are looking at. And in particular, we're thinking about students communicating with stakeholders and collaborating with partners, presenting their work and making sure that they're meeting the needs of their community through that work, and using the design thinking process. So all of our CTE courses are based off of this design thinking cycle, understanding and empathizing with a user or stakeholder, defining a problem, ideating around solutions to that problem, prototyping solutions, testing them, and then often having to come right back to square one or square two and do that all over again by taking feedback. So those are some really important skills that sort of cross every project that we try to work on with students. In action, how has this looked? So our students have been meeting with FIT students off campus. They've been going to the school and meeting with both the faculty, so they get adult direct feedback and instruction, as well as then working in very small groups of 3 to 5 people who are juniors at FIT, working with very specific questions as they go through their the project and making sure that we're keeping the scope really discrete for them. So it's a very short-term project, only 4 weeks. We also understand another tip that things that drag on longer than 4 or 5 weeks tend to feel a little bit more difficult to keep students engaged, particularly this year. And what's next? So our students are just finishing up their project, and they'll have the opportunity to share these informal presentations to a mixed group of students, staff, parents, other industry partners, custodial staff, and funders. And they'll figure out which of these designs really meet community needs. They'll take feedback, and then they'll talk the practical part. If we have a budget for this project, how will we actually fundraise to make it something we can implement this summer while students are out of the building?
Before we conclude today, we thought it was important, having listened ourselves to everything Melissa had to say, having watched her video, we thought it was important to draw a small line under this idea of mutuality that Melissa mentions in her recording. It was really wonderful to hear her talk about what students get out of this activity. But if you'll recall, she talked about other people benefiting as well. And I think that's important to note, particularly when it comes to the CTE team that she is a part of. Her work in planning the work-based learning is sort of apart from, but also a part of the CTE team. And so the fact that they have this longer term goal of expanding the pathway learning and including skills like furniture design that are new to the program and that better reflect student interest, and this work-based learning activity is a nice little kind of not a sneak preview, but it sort of sets that up. It sort of prefaces the expansion of that, the pathway learning is a really wonderful benefit that the activity didn't have to have, but it just so happened that it could be planned in a way that it did. Similarly, she talked and she spoke at greater length and more explicitly, I think, about the benefit to the industry partner and how the industry partner is benefiting in their own goals for the organization that they represent and the population that they are serving. There's a lot in that activity that they can take back and that they can use. And also they benefit in the sense that this is a small way to start their partnership. I believe that Melissa mentioned the partnership as being relatively new. And with a new partner, you don't necessarily want to jump into the big ask, right? The 12-week internship or whatever the case may be. Sometimes having a kind of a more bite-sized collaboration where the partner can get a feel for the school and the students and start to get really excited about the collaboration, that builds energy and will and know-how for larger and more complex collaborations. So all of that is to say, we just wanted to mention this because the mutuality of benefit in a work-based learning work-based learning activity is something we hadn't spoken of before.
I'm just focusing on the starting small. I think the starting small actually gives an opportunity to build a more meaningful relationship between yourself and the industry partner. And I'm not saying that any one way is right, but I think the starting small, we're still in the stage where we're filling each other out. But as I get to know you as the industry partner and you as the industry partner get to know my students, we can create together on the different activities that we can build out as we go along, as opposed to making me big promises that maybe can't be sustained in the current state of our partnership. And as always, help us here if you need it. Our timely professional learning and development sessions, more dates to follow. We also provide one-on-one or small group coaching, and all responses to your questions as needed. We can follow up with you at any one of the email addresses listed below. As always, thank you for joining us for our work-based learning microcourse series. Please be on the lookout for our upcoming presentations. And please also look out for emails for access to our previously recorded presentations. We thank you once again and take care.